method. Thanks, Ed.
Okay. So, despite what Henry says about the topic, Deleuze method being maybe not so strict, that's what I'm trying to do. So, I'm going to try and give an overview of what I see as Deleuze and Guattari's method. But my aim is not going to be to give a single definition, but to look at how their method changes over the course of their working relationship. However, rather than arguing or seeing the changes or transformations that their practice goes through as something that renders their work inconsistent, my aim is to show how the degree of consistency that their work has is actually constituted by the transformations that it undergoes. So I'm going to start with a little preamble about mountains to introduce a recurrent aspect of their work, one which I think would be helpful for us to keep in mind. In part two, I'm going to turn a bit more to text and discuss what we might call three different moments in the development or the individuation of the Deleuze-Guattarian method. And then finally, in the third section, I'm going to try and pull some of those things together and try and show that this method I'm speaking of, while it's, as I say, neither coherent nor systematic, has a degree of consistency that allows us to think about Deleuze's project and Deleuze-Guattari's various projects together. Okay, so preamble about the mountains. Consider this mountain, a great solid mass of stone, an immense, static, and immovable feature of the landscape. I've chosen it partly because it's as close as I could get to a picture of solidity itself. However, if we were to ask a geologist, we might hear something different. From a geological perspective, this is in fact a picture of an encounter, or a collision between two tectonic plates. It's the crest of a wave being pushed upwards. It's still being pushed upwards at about 2 millimeters a year, also being eroded at different rates, also ice melt, so each year it kind of goes up and down a bit. So, in a certain sense, this is not a static or movable mass. It's a great assemblage of forces. Some of them are operating at the macro scale of tectonic plates and over the time scale of millennia, some at the microscopic scale of water erosion and at the time scale of the day, some at the climactic scale of global heating. So a geologist might picture it less like this entity and more like this map of forces that constitute the transformation of the mountain. So what happens if we make this same step from the entity to the forces that compose it with other kinds of entities? Not just physical or material objects, but abstract entities like nation states or psychical states, or to universals like man or power. How might these entities appear differently to us if we were to look past their apparent unity to the forces that compose them? So if you know Deleuze-Guattari's work, then this mode of questioning might seem very familiar to you. For example, to take one little bit of writing, the apparatus of capture section of 1,000 Plateaus could be thought of as a geology of the nation state. It's an investigation of the various forces, both historical and present, both macro and micro, which give rise to and maintain the apparent solidity of the state. Moving to another level of abstraction, what if we were to do the same thing, make this geological move, with the structure of experience, the apparent unity of subjective experience, the apparent solidity of spatial locations or temporal moments? Well, again, this is one way of thinking about Deleuze's work at the moment of difference and repetition in logical sense. What Deleuze refers to as transcendental empiricism can literally be understood as an investigation not of the necessary preconditions for the possibility of experience in a Kantian mode, but of the actual forces that give rise to the apparent unity of subjective experience. Now, taking the experiment one step further again, and this is where I think it gets kind of exciting, what happens if we take this geological approach to the very conceptual apparatus that we are using to think? So, for example, what happens if we consider concepts, ideas, propositions, arguments, in this way. Ultimately, what happens to our thought if we reapproach the activity of thinking in such a way that the tools we are using to think are, like the mountain, in a state of constant variation, fluctuating and adapting according to their environment and to their use. So my contention is that to make sense of Deleuze and Guattari's philosophical methodology, we need to pay close attention to this aspect of their writing. Concepts, including, for example, the concept, are assemblages of forces all the way down. They're in a constant state of transformation, so that whenever we use a concept, we are altering it. The very act of putting a concept to use puts it in tension with other concepts, and they're all altered in the process. In fact, I'm going to argue, or I'm going to suggest, that concepts are not only transformed by the productive tensions of their use, but are formed this way. The creation of concepts is always this type of transformation. I think this way of thinking also helps us to get to grips with some of the more abstract terminology that Deleuze and Guattari use to discuss the operation of thought. So in the rhizome section of 1,000 Plateaus, which in a certain sense offers a methodology, they state that, in contrast to the majority of thinkers in the history of philosophy, they're less interested in propositions, ideas, concepts. And instead they say, all we talk about are multiplicities, lines, strata and segmentarities, lines of flight and intensities, machinic assemblages of their various types, bodies without organs in their construction and selection, the plane of consistency, in each case the unit of measure. So I take this to be a kind of inventory of the concepts used to investigate the forces that compose thought. So if I was going to put them in a table, it would be a bit like this. The effect of the mountain, the forces that compose it, the kind of architecture of thought, and then an attempt to think about the forces that compose the architecture of thought. Okay, so that's kind of what I want to say in this preamble. But I want to just say one other thing before I turn to section 2, which is I want to pose a question that Deleuze and Guattari pose in their final book, What is Philosophy? They ask, what unity remains for philosophies, it will be asked, if concepts constantly change? If philosophy sets itself this task of investigating the forces that compose thought, and if it's the case that to use a concept is to change it, then how does any one philosophy hang together? How can we trust the ground we stand on if everything is changing under our feet? How can we look at two different books by Deleuze and draw inferences across them? How can we even read 2 pages of the same book and trust that the words haven't changed their meanings as we go on? I think this is also a problem of method, not just for the reader, but for the writer. How do we know what we're doing? How do we make sense of what we're doing? How can we orient ourselves in thought if the conceptual apparatus of our thinking is in motion? Another way to put this, and one that I'm going to return to at the end, is how can we use a philosophical methodology that's neither coherent nor systematic? Okay. Part 2. So if part 1 gave a little snapshot of an idea, but also the whole direction of this paper is to say we need to look at anything in its mode of transformation, and rather than just saying this is a thing that Deleuze and Guattari do, I want to look at the process of transformation that has allowed us to see this. So the idea here is to look at 3 different moments across the various different writings that Deleuze and Guattari produced. So first I'm going to say something about Deleuze's metaphilosophical comments, chapter 3 of Difference and Repetition. Then I'm going to explain how Deleuze and Guattari deviate from this original picture in the Capitalism and Schizophrenia series. And finally, I'm going to turn to their account of philosophical method and what is philosophy. Show something that develops or changes or transforms as we go. So, starting. So in the 3rd chapter of Difference and Repetition, titled The Image of Thought, Deleuze distinguishes himself from the history of philosophy by drawing a distinction between what he calls subjective presuppositions and objective presuppositions. He argues here that the discipline of philosophy has always defined itself by the activity of doing away with presuppositions. By inspecting their own thoughts, dispelling any unjustified beliefs, and by taking nothing for granted, the philosopher tries to attain knowledge which is certain. Unfortunately, according to Deleuze, while philosophers have been busy expelling their explicit or objective presuppositions, these are philosophical propositions or apparent truth statements. Any of those that can't be justified have to go. They've failed to recognize a hidden set of implicit or subjective presuppositions. And specifically, Deleuze claims, philosophers have always taken for granted, as a kind of common sense, what it means to be thinking. So taking Descartes' Meditations as his major example, Deleuze writes that the innovation of Descartes' cogito can be seen in his avoidance of any scholastic objective presuppositions. If we define man as a rational animal, in our classic scholastic mode of definition, then we need to presuppose the meanings of rational and animal. I'll just push the problem back one step. The cogito avoids any such explicit presuppositions, but according to Deleuze, it faces other issues. It says, Descartes does not escape presuppositions of their own kind. Subjective or implicit presuppositions contain opinions rather than concepts. It's presumed that everyone knows, independently of concepts, what is meant by self, thinking, and being. It's immediately apparent to us that the cogito kind of works because we know what thinking is like. So for Deleuze, these subjective or implicit presuppositions is anything which takes the form everybody knows. And here Deleuze is not concerned with specific empirical claims, which philosophers have taken for granted, but with methodological claims that concern the philosopher's intimacy with thinking. We know what thinking is like. We know when we are thinking. Once we've reached a conclusion, we will be able to recognize it. What the philosopher takes for granted in the implicit or subjective presuppositions is therefore, quote, not a particular this or that, but the form of representation or recognition in general. For this reason, Deleuze will write that, quote, conceptual philosophical thought has as its implicit presupposition a pre-philosophical and natural image of thought, borrowed from the pure element of common sense. So as Deleuze explains in an interview published in the same year as Difference from Repetition, the problem that we face as philosophers is that, quote, we live with a particular image of thought, that is to say, before we begin to think, we have a vague idea of what it means to think. And then, in a move which commentators have viewed variously as brilliant or naive, Deleuze then asks, or sets himself the task of producing what he calls, quote, a philosophy which would be without any kind of presuppositions, that would find, quote, its true beginning not in an agreement with the pre-philosophical image, but in a rigorous struggle against this image. This is what Deleuze calls, quote, a thought without an image. And it's this which he attempts to produce, I think, in the latter half of Difference from Repetition. So if we return to our table, these are a bit sketchy, the attempts to use the tables, but in a sense, this is where we're at. Deleuze is saying, okay, well, we can't take for granted the structure of thought. We need to put into question what comes before thought, what gives rise to thought. We can't assume the pre-given structure of thought. Okay, so moment number 2. So in the transition from Difference and Repetition, and I would also say from Logical Sense, to the Capitalism and Schizophrenia series, Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Episodes, something significant changes. In effect, when Deleuze begins to work with Guattari, rather than attempting to do away with all presuppositions, subjective and objective, they decide to experiment with different sets of presuppositions. So I'm going to give a long quote here, which is taken from Deleuze's preface to the English edition of Difference and Repetition. So this came out in 1994, so Deleuze is writing about Difference and Repetition at a point after having written 1,000 Episodes. He says, in this book, Difference and Repetition, it seemed to me that the powers of difference and repetition could be reached only by putting into question the traditional image of thought. By this I mean not only that we think according to a given method, but also that there is a more or less implicit, tacit, and presupposed image of thought which determines our goals when we try to think. It goes on, that's kind of what I've been saying. He goes on to say, it's the third chapter which now seems to be the most necessary and the most concrete, and which serves to introduce subsequent books up to and including the research undertaken at Guattari, where we invoked a vegetal model of thought, the rhizome in opposition to the tree, a rhizome thought instead of an arborescent thought. So we can notice here how the language of a thought without image drops away. Instead, Deleuze speaks of invoking a different image of thought, a vegetal image of thought. So it's in the rhizome section of 1,000 Plateaus that Deleuze and Guattari give a much more detailed account of what they mean by this vegetal image of thought. What they seem to be saying in that plateau is something like this. What previous philosophers have taken for granted was that thought had a certain underlying structure. Pre-philosophical common sense had assumed that thought should be orderly, sequential, and linear. That at each stage of an argument, the thinker is faced with a binary option, either this or that, which must be decided on, resulting in a kind of branching structure of decisions that mirrors the systematic growth of trees. The task of the philosopher is then only to organize their thought so that it would fit this structure. Philosophical texts have followed this structure and have therefore proceeded sequentially through chapters that must be read in order to proceed from first principles to a conclusion that follows logically from it. In Anti-Oedipus, and then more explicitly in 1,000 Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari do something very surprising. Not only do they try and show that such presuppositions about the nature of thought are unjustified, they also recognize that we cannot start to think unless we take some sort of image of thought for granted. Thinking cannot get outside itself. Practicing a thought without image doesn't go anywhere. Thinking always takes place in response to a problem, and when we are faced with a problem, we need to start somewhere. But, and I think here's the novelty, it's kind of undecided up to that moment which image of thought to work with. Any image of thought is presupposed, so let's presuppose a different one and see what happens. What if we were to presuppose that thought should be nonlinear? What if we were to presuppose that rather than solving our problem by organizing our thoughts into a coherent structure, we were to solve our problem by dismantling the structure that was causing the problem? What if, rather than writing a book in which each chapter follows logically from the last, we were to write a book in which the different sections all cross-referenced each other so that they can be read in any order? This is what I take Deleuze and Guattari to be doing when they invoke the vegetal image of thought, also named the rhizomatic image of thought. And then the whole of the Capitalism and Schizophrenia series can be read as a series of experiments to determine what would happen if we approached various social, political, scientific, and artistic problems with a different set of implicit presuppositions. So on our table, we put something like this to a critique of a pre-given image of thought. I just use a kind of geological map, static map of where the mountain rock are on the mountain, saying that's how thought was assumed to be organized. Let's assume it's organized differently. Let's take a different model. Okay, that was moment two, kind of different repetition to 1,000 Plateaus. I'm going to look at something that changes when we move to what is philosophy. So in What is Philosophy, Deleuze and Guattari provide a new set of terminology for explaining the practice of doing philosophy. And their approach contains three key terms, which usefully they put together in one sentence. Philosophy presents three elements, each of which fits with the other two, but must be considered for itself. The pre-philosophical plane it must lay out, that's the image of thought we've been talking about. The persona or personae it must invent and bring to life, and the philosophical concepts it must create. Let's start with the concept and the plane. So in a broader attempt to distinguish philosophy from science and art, Deleuze and Guattari claim that philosophy, quote, philosophy is the art of forming, inventing, and fabricating concepts. For Deleuze and Guattari, philosophy is, at this point, philosophy is activated when someone encounters a problem, and when they must create a new concept to express this problem. the expression of a new problem by way of a new concept does not leave the rest of thought untouched. I think Deleuze and Guattari describe it something like this. Concepts all interact in a mutually upholding web of interrelations. This web of concepts determines a field of thought, which regulates what it's possible to think. When, in an attempt to pose a new problem, a philosopher is forced to create a new concept, the introduction of this new concept into the conceptual field affects a reorientation of the whole web of interrelations. The name that Deleuze and Guattari give to the preconceptual field of concept relations is the, quote, plane of immanence. They explain that, quote, the plane of immanence is not a concept that is or can be thought, but rather the image of thought. The image thought gives itself of what it means to think, to make use of thought, to find one's bearings in thought. Deleuze and Guattari are forthcoming with examples of concepts from the history of philosophy. Quote, Aristotle's substance, Descartes' cogito, Leibniz's monad, Kant's condition, Schelling's power, Bergson's duration. Whether the word chosen is already in common use, or whether it's a new coinage, in each case the concept in question is understood by Deleuze and Guattari, as I was saying, as the expression of a problem that was previously inexpressible. And the creation of this concept effectively reorients philosophy around a new set of problems. The third term in Deleuze and Guattari's new explanatory trio is the conceptual persona. This term is necessary because the creation of concepts always requires the philosopher to speak and to think from a particular point of view. The authors explain that, quote, conceptual personae constitute points of view according to which planes of immanence are distinguished from one another. Different points of view have different images of thought, basically. If philosophical thought is activated by an encounter with a problem, then it's always someone who encounters this problem. This someone is not, however, a person in the social sense, but something akin to an intellectual perspective. The conceptual persona is the becoming of the subject of philosophy. In everyday life, speech acts refer back to psychosocial types who actually attest to a subadjacent third person. I decree mobilization as President of the Republic. I speak to you as Father, and so on. In the same way, the philosophical shifter is a speech act in the third person, where it's always a conceptual persona who says I think as idiot, I will as Zarathustra, I dance as Dionysus, and again, Deleuze and Guattari supply a list of examples. For Kant to create the concept of conditions, he must think from the perspective of the conceptual persona of the judge. And in doing so, he institutes a new plane of immanence named the tribunal of reason. For Nietzsche to create the concept of bad conscience, it was necessary to invent a new conceptual persona of the priest, etc. What is important here is that part of the creative act of doing philosophy involves taking up a new perspective or a new position that hasn't previously been taken up. And it's because the list of possible perspectives on any given phenomena is infinite that philosophy always has new problems to express and thus needs new concepts to express them. Quote, the list of conceptual personae is never closed, and for that reason plays an important role in the evolution and transformations of philosophy. So as we can see, this account of philosophy is not completely unconnected to the analyses that we've already considered in Difference and Repetition and 1,000 Plateaus. Here, however, Deleuze and Guattari are much more generous to those other thinkers in the history of philosophy with whom they compare themselves. While in Difference and Repetition, Deleuze had simply critiqued Descartes for accepting implicit presuppositions. That is, for failing to challenge the dogmatic image of thought. Here, Deleuze and Guattari note Descartes' innovation of the conceptual persona of the skeptic and his invention of the concept of the cogito does alter the image of thought. Without tearing it up completely, Descartes' mode of writing creates shifts in the pre-philosophical expectations of what thought should be. According to this account, what Deleuze and Guattari were doing in Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus was not dissimilar to what Descartes was doing in the Meditations, methodologically. In Anti-Oedipus, for example, they were speaking from the perspective of a novel conceptual persona, namely the schizophrenic. They were also creating concepts, most notably the concept of desire and production. And they were also instituting a new plane of immanence by changing the landscape of what it's possible to think. Okay, so just quickly recapping those three moments. In Difference and Repetition, Deleuze characterizes his philosophy as the act of struggling with the dogmatic image of thought. In 1,000 Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari claim that their work involves experimenting with images of thought, and more specifically, the invocation of a new image of thought, which would be vegetal or rhizomatic. And then in What is Philosophy, Deleuze and Guattari claim that all philosophy involves instituting a new image of thought. But they add the proviso that in order to do this, the philosopher must always speak from the perspective of a novel conceptual persona who is forced to invent a new concept. So interestingly, and given the image of the mountain with which we started, in What is Philosophy, Deleuze and Guattari named this approach Geophilosophy. Images of thought are like landscapes in what it's possible to think. Philosophical thinking is then equivalent to the geological transformations that are constantly shaping this image of thought. This geological image of thought is particularly helpful for making sense of the internal transformations of Deleuze or Guattarian philosophy. So this is a quote from a letter that Deleuze wrote to Konichi Uno, describing his relationship with Guattari. Perhaps I should compare him to the sea. He always seems to be in motion, sparkling with life. He can jump from one activity to another. He doesn't sleep much, he travels, he never stops. He never ceases. Interestingly, ceases is in italics in nature. He has extraordinary speeds. I'm more like a hill. I don't move much. I can't manage two projects at once. I obsess over my ideas, and the few movements I do have are internal. But crucially, he's not saying I'm static, he's saying my internal movements are slower. So Deleuze is a hill in the landscape of thought. His work is the expression of a deep, subterranean transformation of the history of philosophy. Guattari is like the sea, eroding and shaping the hill, whilst also being contained and channeled by it. So I'm not sure this bit's a bit speculative, but maybe this makes the Capitalism and Schizophrenia series into a fjord, possibly a volcanic island, or maybe an archipelago. Something like that. Okay, that's part two with the three different moments. I'm just going to, at the end, return to this question about coherent, systematic, and their relationship to method. What we've just seen to be the constantly evolving terminology of Deleuze and Guattari's respective and collaborative projects has led readers of these works to take up different positions concerning the degree to which this collection of written work can be read together as expressing a systematic or coherent body of work. So I'm going to take a couple examples. In his book Deleuze and Language, Jean-Jacques Le Cercle offers a close reading of Deleuze's philosophical methodology, as it arises within Deleuze's writings on language. There, Le Cercle describes Deleuze as a coherent philosopher who does not claim to be a systematic one. For Le Cercle, Deleuze utilizes a system of concepts which is nevertheless unsystematic, because it always relies on a correlation or cross-reference between two series of concepts. The two series of concepts do not form one system, so they're unsystematic, but are related by a particular method which he calls connective synthesis. This is Le Cercle's way of explaining why the meaning of conceptual terms is constantly shifting in Deleuze's writing. For Le Cercle, this does not undermine the coherence of Deleuze's project, because while the meanings of the terms change, Deleuze has a coherent method for drawing insights from the changing systems that he's using. And in this sense, Deleuze's multiple works can make sense as a whole without having their own system, because they have a method for comparing and contrasting and drawing inferences across systems. Joe Hughes is one of those who's disagreed with this analysis In his book Deleuze and the Genesis of Representation, Hughes aims to show that beneath the apparent diversity of content in what he calls Deleuze's middle period, I find quite surprising includes his logic of sense, difference from repetition, and anti-Oedipus. He says there's an attempt to build a systematic account across these books of the genesis of representation. So flipping Leclerc's claim on its head, Hughes argues that Deleuze's philosophy is systematic, but incoherent. For Hughes, Deleuze is incoherent because, quote, while a relatively stable structure persists throughout all three books, the technical terms used to describe that structure change. Yet he's systematic because, quote, in spite of the changing senses and changing names, there is a relatively stable structure. This thesis is defended and expanded in Rex Butler's Guide to What is Philosophy. Here Butler argues that, quote, although the terms what is philosophy uses are not the same as in other of their writings, its overall subject matter is. Same subject matter, he said. And this is to say that, although the particular terms used in what is philosophy are different, the role they play within Deleuze and Guattari's argument is comparable to that of their other books. In a sense, Leclerc and Hughes share the same problem, but offer different resolutions to it. They're both aware that Deleuze and Guattari's concepts seem to change their meanings between different texts, and sometimes even within a single text. And yet they're both keen to recognize the existence of some kind of continuing project that crosses the many works. Leclerc aims to resolve this conundrum by showing that Deleuze has a coherent methodology that we can discern as operating below the explicit content of the work. For Hughes, the unity of Deleuze's project is to be found not in a question of method, but in the construction of a unified philosophical system, which once again we can see only by looking below the explicit claims of Deleuze's writing. Thus, while Hughes sets up his account as being, quote, exactly the opposite of the one put forward by Leclerc, in fact these two readers both search for a hidden unity in Deleuze's work, below the apparent diversity of the writing. The account that I've been trying to give today differs from these perspectives. Deleuze and Guattari's methods and their systems of thought are constantly undergoing their own transformations. In this sense, we should say that Deleuze and Guattari's work is both incoherent and unsystematic. The conceptual terminology changes in each book, or even in each plateau, because Deleuze and Guattari are tackling different problems. The terminology changes because new concepts are being created, new personae are speaking, and new planes are being instituted. Anti-Oedipus is not a philosophical attempt to explain Genesis. Instead, I think, it's an attempt to respond to the rise of fascism and the impasse of the fall of communism. It's confronting a problem. What is philosophy is, I think, not yet another concealed attempt to build a systematic account of, for example, Genesis. It's a genuine attempt to answer the question, what is philosophy? It's a problem there that's being confronted. And I think in that sense we should take Deleuze and Guattari at their word. So Deleuze and Guattari's collective works operate as an assemblage that's constituted specifically by the way it's constantly transforming in relation to new problems. So if we ask again, what unity remains for philosophies if concepts constantly change? If the constant transformation of concepts in Deleuze and Guattari's writings lead to a set of works that are incoherent and unsystematic, then how are we to read them as part of the same project? How are we to read them at all? My answer is simply that constant change does not undermine the consistency of something which is itself a transformation. A wave is constituted by the fact that it's in motion. It is a movement. While the process is slower, this is also true of mountain. It is a movement brought about by a collision of tectonic plates. This is why I would suggest the word consistency. To say that the consistency of stone is not the same as the consistency of water is not to claim that water is somehow inconsistent. It's only to say that their internal motions occur at different speeds. My sense is that, partly because of the nature of Deleuze's attempt to think against the implicit presuppositions of philosophy, partly because of the unique encounter of Deleuzean and Guattarian thought. The project that we think of as Deleuze-Guattarian has a more fluid consistency than we might be used to from our training in the history of philosophy. It's less viscous than stone, but it holds together nonetheless. Like all other aspects of their work, Deleuze and Guattari's method does not jump around at random, but transforms itself as it encounters and then expresses new problems. So while Deleuze and Guattari's method changes through the course of their collaborations, we can still talk of a Deleuze-Guattarian method, because it is exactly that method which is transforming itself as